This meeting is being recorded.
Am I visible?
Yes, you are.
Good.
And the screen is visible as well.
Good. Thank you. Some weeks ago, Marieke van Delft asked me to repeat a lecture I'd given for scholars in the history of nobility with an accent on armorial bindings. I understood her question, felt flattered, and saw that alterations were needed for your working group. So, with the approval of your president, I focused on the question whether coats of arms can mean anything else than that the person or institution in question had the book bound for him, her, or itself. I'll give you examples of both the positive and the negative. And I'm happy to see that Jarle already introduced the subject in its complexity, in more or less. By the way, as a former librarian, I felt the need to give the title of each book to the binding shown, although you will seldom have the time to read them and they seldom have a bearing to the subject. A coat of arms with the crowned Polish eagle decorates the corners of the covers of bindings made by Johannes de Lithuania and the so-called Four Saints binder made between 1500 and 1510. Contemporary annotations in the books show that the bindings were commissioned by 3 different theology professors at Krakow University. The arms don't indicate ownership and rather have the meaning that these possessors or their binders wanted to show their love for their native country. Sigismundus Augustus Jagiello, king of Poland from 1548 to his death in 1572, was a great book lover. In 1547, he started his own library in Vilnius in Lithuania, where he was Grand Duke. Yet, all his books were bound in Krakow until 1557. His Krakow binders adhered to one type, bindings in calf, decorated on the covers with blind rolls of a German type, the king's armorial block in gold, the title of the book on the upper cover, and a Latin text pertaining to the ownership on the lower. There can be no doubt that these were made by order of the great Polish king. The Krakow binder Jerzy Müller made the example shown. Henry II, King of France, from 1547 to 1559, was a great book collector and he loved gorgeous bindings. He was raised by the Reine de Poitiers, lady-in-waiting of his mother. He married the Florentine Caterina de' Medici in 1533. They got 10 children, and nevertheless, Diane, who was 20 years his senior, became his mistress. Her influence on him was enormous. The sculpture portrays Diana as the goddess of the hunt and the moon, next to the painted portrait of Henri. Henri had his luxury bindings made on beautiful manuscripts. They're all decorated in a full Renaissance style, much more lavish than that of Sigismundus. This binding is decorated in 3 frames with interlacings and moresques in silver and gold and cut out gilt parchment over satin. The rhombic center compartment shows the royal coat of arms on red morocco, surrounded by intertwining crescent moons, the crowned H, a monogram DH, and bows. Henry wanted to make it clear that these bindings were his and that Diane had to figure on them too, as the moon goddess. Here is another binding with the H of Henri and the crescent of Diane, surrounded by interlacings and French lilies. The H, the HD, and a combination of bow, quiver, and crescent also decorate several spine compartments and the edge of the book block. It is as if the binder wanted to leave no doubt whatsoever for whom the binding was made and in what time. At the end of the 19th century, the binding was taken to be what it seemed to be. Now we know and have recognized by way of comparisons that the binding is false. It was made by the French-Belgian forger Louis Aguet, who worked in the last quarter of the 19th century on an original old book. Special bindings may add much to the price of a book, and then falsifying pays off. In this and similar cases, the arms and other heraldic signs have no meaning for the provenance. Many French important persons of Henri's time and several from abroad who stayed in Paris for a while had their lovely books similarly bound. The famous Anne de Montmorency, Père de France, Marshal and Constable of France, also loved fine books. His arms are painted in the center of a composition of moresques in gold and in blind. William of Orange, 26-year-old, visited Paris in 1559, around the same time, for a diplomatic mission by order of the Spanish King Philip II, then ruler of the Netherlands. Born as a scion of the German Nassau family, William had become important French prince by the inheritance of the princedom of Orange from René de Chalon. You see him here in his luxury harness long before he became the leader of the revolt against Spain, which caused the freedom of the Northern Netherlands and made William famous as the father of the fatherland. During the month he was in Paris, his days were filled with ceremonial obligations, festivities, royal marriages, a hunt, and a festive tournament. Nevertheless, William found the time to experience the way French nobles collected books and to buy 48 luxury books. He had his coat of arms cut in bronze and ordered a book dealer to have his books bound and decorated with the arms in gold and color. Until the end of the 20th century, only 4 of these books were known. Only one in the Royal Library in The Hague, one in Amsterdam University Library, one then in the market, and one in Apeldoorn Loo Palace, of which I don't have an image. The bindings are simply more simple decorated than those of the French nobles. They have 1 or 2 frames, as you see, a small tool at the corners of the inner frame, the center arms, and a shortened title of the book on the upper cover. In 1998, a dealer showed me a small binding, which I recognized right away as of William of Orange. I could acquire it for the library, and for the first and last time in my life came on the prime time news of television and radio. In 2000, I visited the Berlin Staatsbibliothek, where my colleague and friend Andreas Wittenberg showed me the binding storeroom. A rose on a spine caught my eye because it reminded me of the orange bindings, and indeed it was one. Soon a second came to the fore, and then a third. In the end, 15 appeared to be held in that rich and important library. So now 20 of the 48 bindings are known. The books have all sorts of subjects and they are in French, but this one, which is in Dutch. A few other bindings, by the way, with William's are known too, impressed with different blocks, and they were books that were given him. A great help for the study of armorial bindings is the 3-volume work on Belgian ones written by de Jonge d'Ardois and others. The other week, my former colleague and friend Miriam Foot pointed out an equally helpful site on British armorial bindings upheld by the Bibliographical Society. A book in 29 volumes by Olivier and others contains illustrations of arms blocks and arms tools on bindings of more than 2,600 owners who must have possessed many tens of thousands nicely bound armorial books by bindings all in all. Obviously, armorial bindings were made in huge amounts in France in the 16th until 19th century. One of the most interesting bibliophiles of the 18th century was the Marquis De Pompadour. The book by Olivier and others gave 6 variants of her coat of arms, whereby differences in size and of the arms are not considered. important French persons like her possessed arms blocks in different sizes corresponding to the sizes of the books. Of simple descent, she was born in 1729 as Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. She was beautiful, got a very good education, was well married off, and soon was welcome in the highest Paris circles. She met Louis XV, became his mistress in 1745, and became Marquise de Pompadour. She was highly intelligent, had an enormous work zeal, and a much larger possibility to spend money on splendor. She was an able engraver and cut precious stones and founded the Sèvres porcelain factory, among others. She loved books and reading, as many of her portraits show. She looks up in this portrait by Boucher when reading a book which opens smoothly. Book dealers of her time tended to put such simple structures around books for sale. The client then had to have them bound. De Pompadour always wanted we know that to read her books before binding, as we see here. Some bound books are in the bookcase behind the Marquise, and another one lies under the table, bound in red morocco, gold tooled, and with a dark onlay in the center for her arms. Such a binding was made for her by Louise Doucet, then a well-known Paris binder. Her arms with the three towers are tooled over a green onlay piece of leather and is thus very well visible. The doors of the towers are shut. A wavy Louis XV lacework totally built up of small tools encompasses the arms. Another one of her luxury bindings with a straighter lacework border was made by the court bookbinder Antoine Michel Padeloup. The doors of the tower here are open. Between the bindings commissioned by the first owners, you saw also examples where the armorial tools and blocks have nothing to do with them. More of these follow. This binding was thought by the owner to have been made for the French King Louis XV because of his arms on the cover. It occurred to me that the king would never have received such a simple binding on this magnificent series of large and lovely prints concerning festivities held in Strasbourg city on the entrance of the king there in 1744. It soon appeared that Strasbourg had the book printed and had asked the court bookbinder Antoine Michel Padeloup, yes, the same, to bind these 1,000 copies in many degrees of luxury and all with the royal arms. The copies were largely given away by the town to important people. The arms block thus has nothing to do with Louis' ownership, but rather with a royal status and the contents of the book. The king will have received a much more luxurious copy, of which I have not found an image, but it will have looked like the one shown here, which was at the time sold at Christie's. This copy of the Office of the Holy Wick, printed for members of the royal household, is tooled with a roll directly around a huge block with interlacing pattern and the arms of Louis XV. The book was not bound for the king, who will have gotten a more special binding, but for one of the members of his household. The office was regularly republished, and quite a few in these bindings are known. I think that they were bound by order of a bookseller or a publisher, so that they could be sold ready-made. Again, the arms do not indicate royal ownership. The coat of arms and the cipher on these bindings are those of Henri, the last Duke de Montmorency. By the time this book was published, in 1643, he had been dead for 11 years. He had been an important army leader in the wars for the king, but became involved in a revolt against the Cardinal de Richelieu, organized by the younger brother of Louis XIII. The revolt failed, and the king's brother, the Duc d'Orléans, was forgiven, but de Montmorency was beheaded. His wife, who loved and adored him, got the chance to restore his great memory after the death of Richelieu in 1642 and of the king in 1643. She erected an enormous sepulchral monument for her dead husband in Moulins and had a glorification published written by Simon Ducrot, de Montmorency's former secretary and comrade in arms. The copy to the left is the one deposited in the King's Library, now Bibliotheek Nationale, and the one to the right, with de Montmorency's crowned H and his armorial eagle with legs and beak cut off, was given to an acquaintance. He obviously, de Montmorency, obviously did not possess these bindings. His arms are meant to glorify the great man. Notwithstanding the royal arms of Louis XIII on the strewn-out pattern of crowned L's and the fleur-de-lis, this binding was not made for or by order of the king, but by order of the Jesuit College of Clermont. It was paid for by a fund the king had given the college, and it was meant for a very good student at the transition from one class to the other. One doesn't find many of these French prize bindings. Only a few schools seem to have handed them out, and quite a few of them lost their written prize dedication, whereby it's no longer visible that it was a prize binding. A book about the arms of the Chevalier of the Golden Fleece in the Antwerp Plantin Museum has a large block on the covers with the arms of Philip IV of Spain, as recorded in the book of the Jonge d'Ardois already mentioned. The Dutch Koninklijke Bibliotheek has another copy, which is decorated the same. Both copies were certainly not destined for Philip IV. The Plantin copy probably was bound for an ancestor of the Marquis de Pompadour, a member of the order who wrote his name in it, and the KB copy must have been made for another member. Philip IV's binding will have been more richly decorated, I suppose. Contrary to French prize bindings, those from other countries are mostly simply decorated. The very simple Belgian ones are not rare at all, but a lot have lost their prize dedication. The arms on the binding to the left are described by the Jonge d'Ardois as those of the Empress Maria Theresia of Austria, the ruler of the southern Netherlands at the time now Belgium. The date of 1773 under the arms make it clear that this book was never in her possession. It was given away as a prize to a student in one of the Brussels schools, which was installed at the wish of the Empress. The binding to the right has the arms of Antwerp and was given away by the town as a prize to a student at the Antwerp Jesuit School in 1673. The written prize dedication is preserved. More than 40,000 prize bindings were handed out in the Latin schools of the Republic of the United Netherlands between about 1600 and 1850. From about 1650 on, their covers practically always show the arms of the town that paid for them. This example was given to Johann Steengracht when he had completed his school education in 1742 and went to study at Utrecht University. The arms of the town is held by angels over the head of Minerva. Practically every Dutch town, be it small or large, had a Latin school, at least for the time, where these prizes were handed out to the best students. This image shows 10 of them, mainly in parchment and some in calf. The coat of arms is sometimes held by Minerva, as with the School of The Hague in the middle and Kampen underneath it. Some are held by lions, and a laurel wreath is placed around that of Zwolle in the right-hand corner. Others just show the arms. I have little or no experience with prize bindings from other European countries to say something sensible about them, but I expect that it will mostly more or less the same. Maybe it was a typical Dutch feature to place arms on bindings around almanacs. They rarely are those of the first owner. The arms of the Hague on the silver clasp of the binding to the left probably indicates that it was given to the city to an important person. The arms of William V of Orange and Nassau, printed in red ink on the parchment of the bindings to the right, have nothing to do with the stadtholder. The text on the upper covers makes it clear that they were given to one of his clients by a man who provided services in several streets of The Hague. These arms do not indicate that the province of Zeeland had ordered these almanacs for the usage of its functionaries, nor that it had given them away. The printer and publisher, Jan Dane, who was also the binder of these copies in paper, leather, and silk, was proud of his province and sold them thus to other people with the same pride. My experience with English bindings is not good enough to be able to discriminate between arms tooled by order of the person who owned the book and those that were not. Still, it is good to know, when one is interested in English royal bindings of the Restoration period and after, that Bibles and prayer books bound for the use in the royal chapels would get the royal cipher and sometimes also the royal coat of arms on the covers. Quite a few still exist, for they were renewed every 3 or more years. The king would normally only touch the copy reserved for him. These books were after given to important persons, also that of the king. This lovely example comes from the Davis collection and was probably supplied for one of these royal chapels. Sometimes arms, initials, or ciphers were added later, as we already saw. King George III of England had his initials added to many bindings in the royal collection, although they were made for his predecessors. His cipher and arms show that this binding was bound by order of William III, King of England and stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. Later, George III had his initials added above the arms. Only a few Dutch collectors of the 17th and 18th centuries possessed arms blocks for their bindings. I counted no more than 20 persons who possessed their own arm blocks, including the stadtholders of the Orange and Nassau family. Yet many bindings from the library of William IV and William V have their coat of arms on the covers. They can still be found in the Dutch Koninklijke Bibliotheek. These books were given them in a nice binding, the donor usually hoping for a special favor. This probably is the most luxurious binding ever given to William IV, albeit in a certain horror vacui. His arms, almost invisible in the center, is done with a hand tool, placed in a laurel wreath and surrounded by crown drawer handle tools. The famous treaty on playing the violin of Leopold Mozart in a Dutch translation was published by the great Enschede firm in 1766. Its luxury binding is maybe the most interesting, but not the most beautiful one given to William V. Leopold Mozart presented it him when he was in our country with his prodigies. The reason for the gift was that the Mozarts had been well received at the stadtholder's court and that the court physician, Schwenke, had been able to cure both children from a typhoid. Sometimes bindings were given away with arms not of the receiver, but of the donor, as we already saw with prize bindings. In 1773, a group of scholars finished a new translation and rhyming of the Psalms by order of the States General, which had to be sung in each Dutch Reformed church from then on. The States had them printed in quarto format on good and large paper and sent them to important institutions and persons where they had to serve as a model for other editions. They had the copies bound according to the importance of the institution or person, but they all got the arms of the States General on the covers. Well, after all these different functions of a coat of arms, I returned to ownership. One Dutchman had a real interest in bindings with his arms and his crescent moon, namely Johan Hendrik van Wassenaar op Dam. He was a scion of a very old and important Dutch noble family and had many important functions as the States General, the Council of States, the Rhineland Water Board, and Leiden University, for example. At the death of his father in 1714, Johan inherited most of his Holland possessions and became imperial count. He loved art and books and spent much money on both. The important architect and designer Daniel Marot built a luxury house for him, or a small palace, in The Hague in 1723. Johan Hendrik's wish to surround himself with beauty was much larger than his budget. At his death in 1745, his brother and sole heir, Unico Willem, was confronted with huge debts. He had to put up for auction large parts of the art collection and part of the library. But a large part of the library remained in the family and was transported to Twickel Castle in the east of our country later on, and it's still there. Quite exceptionally, many invoices of Johan Hendrik's library are preserved there too. One of those is the only invoice known to me of a tool cutter. The Hague engraver Daniel Koster cut for the count 10 blocks, 9 rolls, and 11 hand tools. The blocks, which were too large to be imprinted by hand and had to be imprinted with a press, were armorial. 3 of them were described as with the Danish order of the elephant. This is strange, for Johan Hendrik's father was known to have received the order, but Johan Hendrik, as far as we know of, not. A few hand tools represent crescent moons and are armorial too, but the other tools and rolls are purely decorative. This is something exceptional for owners who wanted their bindings to be decorated with armorial material. They would order only that to the tool cutter, but not the many tools and rolls needed for building up the further decoration. It's also exceptional that some of the tools are preserved. When I visited the castle for the first time many years ago and saw the library and the invoices and knew that the family was in the habit of not throwing away anything that could still be used, I asked for the tools. One wanted to know what they would look like, so I explained. Much later, I was telephoned. They had found several tools in the kitchen because they had been used to decorate the butter for the dinner parties. One of these tools is a block with the count's arm, surrounded by the order of the elephant indeed. 2 decorative rolls were found and 2 blocks with the crescent in a nice border. Several binders worked for the count at the same time. Most important was Isaac Hagelman. From his invoices, I show only 2 of them. It appears that he bound volumes of large series and bound above all large books for the count. Johan Hendrik lent his tools to Hagelman for the period that he worked for him. The binding to the right, a large quarto format, is decorated in 2 frames, a crescent block in the corners, and the arms of the count with the order in the center. Most spine compartments show the crescent. The large volume to the left is tooled with a broad frame of rolls, the crescent in the corners, and the arms in the center. Here too, the crescent adorns most spine compartments. Sorry. The spines with their crescent moons look quite impressive in Twickel Castle, just as they must have looked in the Count's Hague house in the 18th century for his visitors. The armorial bindings of Sigismundus Augustus of Poland and the Dutchman Johan Hendrik van Wassenaar were commissioned by them. King nor Count were interested in the kind of luxury of Madame de Pompadour or Henry II. William of Orange occupied a place in between as regard decoration. These bindings show what one tends to consider as normal for armorial bindings, namely that they were bound by order of the person whose arms are on them. As we saw, these persons might also get nicely bound books as presents, which were also decorated with their arms. Arms can also mean something else. The Polish eagle on the binding of my first image, the arms of the binding on the Strasbourg book with Prince, of the Almanach Royal, of the book glorifying Henri de Montmorency, the arms on the French, on the Belgian, and on the Dutch prize bindings and other bindings which persons or institutions gave away, or those on almanacs from the Netherlands, on bindings for the English royal chapels, and the coats of arms that were added later on, and finally those of the falsifications. All these show that one must be very careful to interpret them without further thought as to those of the person who had the book bound. For me, it was only while compiling this lecture that I realized how interesting the subject is and how important the knowledge can be for the research in provenances. Thank you.
Okay, Jan.